მოგესალმებით ყველას და გახსნილად ვაცხადებ ფორმალური ლინგვისტიკის მესამე სკოლას. პირველი ლექცია იქნება პროფესორი როზმარი დრეისის, რომელიც არის მანჰეიმის უნივერსიტეტის პროფესორი და ის ისაუბრებს ენის შესწავლის საკითხებთან დაკავშირებით. დღეს მეორე ლექცია ყავის შესვენების მერე იქნება მარია პოლინსკის, რომელიც წარმოადგენს თანამედროვე მეთოდოლოგიებს ენის საკითხებთან დაკავშირებით. Well, welcome to this season school, and the first lecture would be, I already talked this in Georgian, so with Rosemary Tracy from Mannheim University, and she will speak about topics in language acquisition. So it's my pleasure to introduce her. So let's listen here. I will not take much time because we already lost some time. Yeah.
Good morning from me as well. I'm very pleased to be here and part of this event, and I'd like to thank the organizers and Masha for including me in this in the summer school. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. Now, I didn't know what to expect in terms of audience, in terms of background on language acquisition. Some of you may already have been involved or may be involved in acquisition, so today will be a relatively informal introduction, a general first taste of what I would like to do, a brief overview of the acquisition types I would like to address, and then as of tomorrow I can target individual types of language acquisition and go into more detail. But I'd also like to find out from you what your preferences and your ideas are, so I can adjust my presentations. Now, I have a simple question. Oh, by the way, what you see here is my University of Mannheim. It's located in one of the largest palaces of Europe. Supposedly, it has one window more than Versailles. I did not try an empirical investigation to see whether that is actually true. So I have a very simple question for starters. And who is in this room is bilingual, multilingual? Yeah, and I would assume all hands to really go up. Now, because, I mean, I speak in English, and your first languages is not English in all cases, in all these cases. So those who were too modest to raise their hands were probably, they were probably too modest. Oh, they knew what I was going to get at. Sometimes when I give a talk in English to an audience with different language background, it's quite puzzling that in a crowd of about 200, you may see 20 people raising their hands. And that's really strange. That means that there is a fake comprehension. Yeah, because and when I ask them, are you native speakers of English? And they say no, except for one or two, then that means that there is a fake comprehension, or they are too modest, or they have a very conservative idea of who has the right to call themselves multilingual or bilingual. And so I usually tell them this is curable, okay, that this conservative or attitude is curable. So my goals and topics in general for these next few days, I'd like to say something about why the linguist's voice on language acquisition is very, very much needed today, apart from finding out more about how it works. Then I'd like to find out a little bit more about your interests and your goals for a language acquisition lecture for the next few days. And I'll talk a little bit about the conceptual basics, types of acquisition, about methodology, the learner's natural curriculum, the paths of different acquisition types, and also why it's so difficult to distinguish them. And clearly I'll be talking a little bit about acquisition theory and linguistic connection to linguistic theory. And a topic that's very close to my heart is the bilingual resourcefulness. So I'd like to spend one section of this overall lecture to talk about code switching. And in a student paper I got a few months ago, the student had committed a slip of the pen. She wrote code witching. And I realized that's it. You know, it's really some witchcraft that enables us to be so good at switching effortlessly and without hesitation from one language to the other. And I'd like to talk a little bit about reasons for code switching, both in children, when they sort of combine their resources to fill gaps in one or the other language, and then also look at sort of stylistically motivated switching in adults, discourse motivated switching in adults. So that's what I definitely like to do. Now my own background, I worked on different types of language acquisition. I'm a generativist with a passion for exceptions. So I always liked the data that looked messy at first sight and then turned out to be very orderly, very systematic. And I find that very, very exciting. I'm also very much intrigued, not just by competence, but by the virtuosity of performance. So that'll have a lot to do then with code switching, for instance. So just to give you an example from a child aged 2 years and 9 months, young bilingual, German-English bilingual, growing up with 2 first languages. And at one point she says, "Don't störe mich, nicht mich stören" in English or German. So translated, "Don't bother me, not me bother" in English or German. So does anybody have a hunch why we should believe her that she speaks both English and German at this time, that she knows what she's talking about, that one part of her clause is English, another clause is German? Anything that would give you a hunch of why she has a pretty good idea that one is English and the other one is German? I mean, clearly on the lexical level, störe is not an English word, okay? It's a German word, stören, yeah. Bothering somebody. Okay, so it's a lexical borrowing, but if you just take the syntax into consideration, that you see the word order, you see that in English, the mich, the direct object follows, as a complement follows the head verb, and then in German, if you have an infinitival verb, it precedes. Yeah? So she knows that she says something in English, something in German. Ignore the morphological borrowing. We do this all the time, and we then sort of the morphology adapts to whatever language they pick. So this is just an example from a child.
Mother English, father German.
Yes, right. But at that time, both. Yeah.
Thinking in English.
Yeah, I mean, she's spoken both languages from when she first started combining words, except German stayed her preferred language for a long time. I talk about that. And both of her parents, at this point, both of her parents had started speaking to her in English for about a year because they were worried about English sort of lagging behind German too much. I can give you some reasons for why this is the case. So, and this is an old lady, 84 years old, who I recorded in the United States in a code switching project. And she says, well, talking about her life, well, it wasn't easy, but irgendwie da hat sich's rentiert. Nicht? So a very smooth code switch from one language to the other. And it also corresponds to different contents. Yeah? On the one hand, on the other hand. Yeah, on the one hand, using one language, on the other hand, so a contrast that she marks that way. So this is what I mean by virtuosity of performance, and clearly there's a lot of underlying competence that we will get at. So a few years ago, Gary Marcus wrote this wonderful book called Kludge, the haphazard construction of the human mind. Some of you may know this, where he defines a kludge as a clumsy or inelegant solution to a problem. That's the way he represents, so his idea of the way the brain got constructed. And I'd like to convince you in the next few days that acquisition is a very elegant and non-random solution to various problems, to specific challenges of the input, and that code mixing, code switching is an elegant solution to online challenges, and also to challenges like, for instance, asymmetrical development between two languages, because one may be more advanced than the other. So this means that one language may be used to fill gaps in the other. And I'm particularly interested in the structural placeholders, not just in the borrowings, for instance. So now, not really knowing what drove you here, or what made you come to a lecture on language acquisition, I assume some common ground. So that everybody here has moved beyond typical myths or attitudes, such as that bilingualism is an exception or even unnatural, a threat to identity and loyalty. You know, when you speak to politicians in various countries, you still get the idea that they're really worried about this. Then I'm sure you've also given up the idea, or never had it, that people are either perfect in one language or sloppy in many. Very prevalent attitude. Or that bilinguals should behave as if they weren't. So even though some people may be convinced that bilingualism is something positive, they don't expect you to behave like a bilingual. That means you should speak just one language, or you should speak the other one, but not mix. So even though you may have a positive attitude towards bilingualism, you should still have some very, very rigid assumptions about the way people should behave. And they don't see the competence that goes into the mixing behavior. Then, I'm sure we have all given up double standards. That means depending on the prestige of languages, on the symbolic market, you think that bilingualism is good in some cases and bad in the other case. Yeah, and that generally, what we still find, especially when we talk to kindergarten teachers, school teachers, at least in Germany, you often find this deficit fixation instead of sort of seeing what's already there, the competence orientation. So in all of these domains, the linguist should really have something to cure people of these beliefs. But I assume this is already common ground among us here. So let me give you an example of what I mean by attitude towards languages. A couple of years ago, there was an article in a German newspaper that asked whether we shouldn't introduce Turkish as a regular language option. Besides English, French, Latin, Old Greek, and occasional other languages you get in German high schools. Sometimes Spanish, Russian sometimes, like in my school, we had a teacher who happened to know Russian, so she offered a Russian course. But it was not part of the official Russian program. So anyway, this article had the label Turkish as a third language option in high schools, and the next day I got a phone call where I was asked, would that not interfere with the acquisition of German? That's sort of in this section of the text. And after what I said so far, you can probably imagine what I said. I said, well, have you ever considered whether math or Old Greek or biology is a hindrance to the acquisition of German? But you see the attitude behind it, right? Latin, who needs it today, okay? Or other languages, many other languages, that would not be questioned. But if you have a speaker of Turkish or some other immigrant language in Germany, then that would be questioned relatively easily. The guy who interviewed me, he laughed immediately when I asked my question whether he ever considered whether math or biology was a hindrance, because he realized how, what he had suggested. So anyway, on the other hand, another article in a very well-known German paper, Die Zeit, shows that if a child, or claims that if a child knows, in this case, English, French, and German, now how wonderful, a trilingual kid, it's at kindergarten age, isn't that great? So you see very clearly how the status of the language matters, yeah, and that's sort of certainly not appropriate. I'd like to continue for just a moment with the situation in Germany, because in German schools German schools were heavily criticized after the international educational studies, which ran under the name of PISA or the OECD studies, because Germany didn't really do very well. Reading abilities in the ninth graders were pretty poor, and comprehension was pretty poor. And so that's when that was a wake-up call to the German educational system. There have been changes for the positive, but also changes that are highly problematic, I think. But anyway, what the situation in Germany and in some other countries, I mean, I know it's the case for Luxembourg or France, we endorse the European vision of trilingual citizens. Our cultural and linguistic diversity is seen as a great asset. But at the same time, there is tremendous helplessness in schools, throughout schools, and even at the universities, in the face of the linguistic diversity already present inside our schools. And the linguistic abilities that children bring to schools is not really appreciated very often, depending on the languages that they come with. And even doctors, when they encounter bilingual families, there's sometimes medical doctors, the pediatricians recommend to stop this nonsense with raising your child as a bilingual, depending on the languages that the family speaks. Yeah. So in German city schools, we do have 90 to 100% of non-first language speakers of German. And every second child in the larger German cities has an immigrant background, and some of them are not exposed to German before age 3. So there is a challenge to the educational system very clearly. Yeah. But then you have to create the conditions for them to learn languages very early. So it's not a problem for the child in principle, it's just a problem of the system. And there's a lot of unfair treatment of immigrant children, poor grades despite the same test results. So this has been shown in sort of anonymous studies that have been conducted, so that depending on what the teacher assumes about the background of the child, sometimes on the basis of the name of the child, then the same results or the same test will be graded, giving sort of a poorer grade. There is also still a high dropout and unemployment rate among young immigrants. So there is a tremendous challenge to the educational system, and language has a lot to do with that. Now, a few more comments on Germany. Until recently, I mean, the intervention programs that have been set up, they haven't really pervaded teacher training yet, and many teachers are unprepared for the challenges involved. I mean, we developed a sort of a language-related test. We tested kindergarten teachers, we tested elementary school teachers, and we saw that the knowledge about how languages are acquired, or even about German as a target language, was very, very poor. In some cases, you could see that a teacher would know 20% of what we assume should be basic knowledge about language and language learning. No? Then, including even the medical professions, there's a lot of under and overdiagnosis. There's very little insight into also complexity of communicative behavior. I mean, we don't have to speak. I mean, speaking is a voluntary activity. And then you know from your own reactions in classes that you often know what to say, you know what to say, but you don't say it for whatever reason. So it's very easy to overestimate somebody or underestimate somebody. Yeah, like if somebody doesn't respond for whatever reason, you think they haven't understood what you are saying. Now, it's also easy to overestimate somebody. You know, if you look at the behavior of children in kindergartens, even kids who, with a non-German background, they enter kindergarten and they seem to understand a lot of things that go on the third or fourth day, but they just do what everybody else does. If everybody else is asked to put on their shoes, then they do that as well. And the kindergarten teacher thinks, hey, that's really great. They already know what I'm talking about. And then you've all experienced a situation where you have laughed at jokes that you did not quite get yet. Yeah. People were laughing, so you laughed as well. That's a polite thing to do, even though you may not have grasped the joke as such. Yeah. So it's easy to underestimate or overestimate somebody. Then also, politicians nowadays call for diagnostics, and the tests that they often apply are total nonsense from a linguistic perspective. They call for accountability, but they underestimate what it takes to really conduct the necessary research. Yeah? If you want to set up some studies, and you need a control group, and you need time, and you need money to do this. And so even though the educational or the politicians require all these changes and developments, they don't usually make available the money that you need. So whatever it is, knowledge societies know, knowledge about language and language acquisition doesn't really figure on the list. So there is still very little knowledge about what it takes to acquire and to foster language acquisition. And so this is why the world needs a linguist and educators with some background in linguistics. Now, I don't know what your experience has been in different educational contexts. Some of this may be similar to what I was saying, and some hopefully is better than the picture that I drew about Germany, for instance. So, and now, I know this is not a popular question, but I would really like to know something about what your interest is. What would you like to talk about within the next few days with respect to acquisition? And then I go into what I want to do. But do you have a concrete expectation or own research that you would like to see addressed, or something that you would like to see addressed? Any idea?
Somehow this process of the second language acquisitions, especially in kids, is it unconsciously or consciously native language?
Okay. Okay. Yes. How?
Basis?
Okay.
Because I have such example. My grandchildren, they are German, half.
Mm-hmm.
So when my son spoke with them in Germany, in Georgia, they just hear but didn't speak at all. Then they appeared in New York. For them, English was foreign language, and it was absolutely, I was surprised because old one, small was really too small for, he makes all English words with Georgian nominative ending.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Fishy,
Yeah.
housey.
Yeah.
So he didn't speak Georgian,
Yeah.
but maybe it was in his acquisition.
Definitely.
Or
Yes.
I don't
Definitely.
know.
Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Fishy, catsy, doggy.
Over here.
It's fantastic. I was really surprised.
Yes.
3 years also.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Yeah.
I'm sure you're going to talk about that, but my hope is to learn about how both L1 and L2 acquisition processes are systematic.
Yes. Yes.
People often have this idea that it's random.
Right.
And
Yeah.
hopefully you will
Yes.
tell us
Yeah.
how we can disabuse that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's not a kludge. It's not a haphazard accumulation of structures or of chunks. Okay. Yes. Okay. I talk about that. Any other idea?
I guess you would be talking about the age value.
Yes. The age factor. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. Neurocognitive. Well, I think that's probably Masha's domain. Yeah, but certainly psycholinguistic and some cognitive issues. Yes.
Georgian child name.
Yes.
And it would be interesting to hear about acquisition of
Yes, I will be talking about stages of acquisition in English and in German, and in a way that hopefully can be directly related to what you're interested in with respect to Georgian. Yes, no, I would be very much interested in hearing more about Georgian.
That's a really interesting issue because there was one investigation into the nation of Georgian kids, how included in typological viewpoint, and the conclusion was that Georgian children are somehow lower in their development, language acquisition, than English-speaking. What was the problem? There was no linguist.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
And they were investigated proverbs. But when you give a narration to children in present, we have no proverbs in present because it makes perfective mood.
Yes.
So they don't use at all.
Yeah.
And the conclusion was that they don't orient it in space.
Yeah.
So
oh yes, I remember that. Yeah.
It's very important to such kind of psychological investigation. Even one
yes. Yeah.
must be included because it was absolutely.
But that was not a bilingual child, was it? Were these bilingual? No. Yeah. So what you would probably see if these children were.
Okay, they need just this informational tests, nothing else.
Yeah.
No.
And then reach a big conclusion about acquisition in general, about this. Okay, that would be a good points that we can discuss. Yeah. Okay.
We talk about trilingualism and multilingualism too.
Just a tiny little bit, the distinction between second and third languages. I can say a little bit about what we are doing currently about investigating English as a third language in children who already know two languages. But I just do this sort of marginally,
So I would like to know the language recruitment process of preterm babies, because there has been a lot of research focusing on the cognitive development of these babies. So I would like to know whether the preterm itself is a respecter of the linguistic development of these babies.
So preterm babies? Okay, all right, okay. Yeah, okay. I mean, I know very little about preterm babies, just a few, read a few papers. I mean, they'll develop, okay, I'll talk about that then, yeah, okay. Okay, so, but I hope that you will all be adding from your own experience at certain points when I come to the relevant types of acquisition. So, I mean, the big questions, so what happens to languages across lifetime, the age factor. The big question would concern the distinction between nature and nurture. Is universal grammar still available? What aspects of universal grammar? What's the function of age? Role of maturation, cognition, like memory and whatever. What's the motivation? I mean, the older you get, the more motivation enters the picture, and because you need to practice. Then quality, quantity of the input, then the bilingual advantages or disadvantages, then non-pathological change as in attrition, I mean the non-pathological development, attrition, and then the pathological development, aphasia, dementia, Alzheimer's, etc., etc. So a lot of questions. My main focus will be on children this time, But these will be questions that will be coming up. Now, one very humorous comment on the acquisition of German was written by Mark Twain, actually. He wrote a wonderful article, The Awful German Language. And if you read this, you see that he comes up with a very grim prognosis about languages such as German, with their inflectional morphology, with sort of the verb moving around, and then with sort of gender, you know, grammatical gender. And then he says that it ought to be possible to learn English in 30 hours, French in 30 days, and German in 30 years. And he recommends counting German among the dead languages, because only the dead have time to learn it. Now, I hope to be able to show you that he's far off the mark with this prediction, and that if you have children who grow up with two languages like German and English, that their German can be much faster than their English, for reasons having to do with the two languages. So I hope I can demonstrate that. Now this is, for those of you who know German, this is the best parody of German I've ever read. You know, it's written in English, the awful German language. It's very, very funny. Okay, so let's then look at language, types of language acquisition. Now, spoken or signed, right? I won't say much about, or anything about sign language, but then there's Carlo, who will probably be able to say more about this. I will ignore literacy. I will also ignore learning, relearning, like after a stroke, through aphasia periods, yeah. So, on the one hand, there's monolingual acquisition, and you can see that I already put a question mark there, questioning to what extent somebody who is monolingual is really monolingual. That means has only one system. And we use different structures, patterns when we write, when we speak. Some patterns that we use in colloquial speech we'd never use in writing. And so we have dialects that differ from the standard considerably. Like in German, you have some dialects that are really incomprehensible to people from other areas, dialectal areas in Germany. And a lot of children, before they reach school age, they are exposed to some local dialect, and then they have to really become bilingual at the latest by the time they enter school. So this is why I made this question mark, that there's probably, many linguists have said that monolinguals probably are just a fiction. They don't really exist. So, from my perspective, if you have two different grammars, you can say that you are bilingual. And I will show you when we talk about first language acquisition and monolingual, supposedly monolingual acquisition, that at times children waver between the old grammar and the new grammar. So they're going through stages where you could say, well, they are bilingual, even though the systems, so it's just sort of one target language they are working their way towards. So I'll show you that with examples, what I mean by saying that even the supposedly monolingual, may have two grammars. Then I'll be talking about bilingual first language acquisition, the acquisition of two simultaneous languages, or even more. I'll say very little about trilingualism. Then we have early second language acquisition, and early means sort of you start between the age of 2, 3, and 5. Researchers are not quite, they disagree slightly about 1 year or the other, but let's say before the age of 4 or 5, you still talk about bilingual first language acquisition, or supposedly monolingual acquisition, and then early successive language acquisition. We have the child second language acquisition between the age of about 4, 6 up to puberty, and then the adult past puberty. That's sort of the rough categories that you find in the literature. And then you have the heritage language acquisition, which sort of cuts across of the others, really, because somebody who may start as a monolingual may then add a second language very early, and the first languages may become heritage languages, or you have a bilingual first language set up with one of the languages then turning into the sort of developing the features of what we now consider a heritage language. So I'd like to speak a little bit about a project that we run at this point, to show you some of the data. except that those, the data I have on the heritage language acquisition of German in the US, that those won't be children, but young adults and adults. But it gives you a good idea of the spectrum of proficiency that we find. And it links very nicely to what we know about language acquisition. And what I'm currently interested in is to, as I told you before, I like messy data or variation. So I studied in the monolingual or in the bilingual, I studied variation between speakers. And the basic idea is that at some point where you find a lot of variation in the monolingual and the bilingual, those might be the areas where the heritage speaker also diverges or stays on a specific trajectory, which in the typical development as a majority language a speaker converges then, but in the heritage speaker you may stay on that variation track that you will already find in early stages of acquisition. And I try to show you some areas where that is the case, especially in the more complex areas that need acquiring, for instance, case marking, gender marking, and that certain phenomena that are acquired very, very early in the young child as a first language speaker or a simultaneous speaker of two first languages, those areas that are extremely robust, they're usually also still robust in the heritage speaker, at least for some phenomena like what we looked at before, for instance, order, head complement order in the verb phrase. Yeah, you may find a lot of variation, but you will still find very stable patterns. And then we have, of course, the contrast between natural acquisition, foreign language acquisition. I may not say much about foreign language teaching, but what I'm basically interested in and try to cover is sort of the natural acquisition or acquisition in the wild, as Masha would probably call it. And then clearly the question comes up: what is the initial state of a second language learner? Is there full access to universal grammar? Is there transfer of the first language grammar and things like that? So we can talk about that. Now, don't forget, there's also specific language impairment cutting across all of these learner types. And specific language impairment is still the most prevalent early developmental problem in childhood. With 6 to 8%, that's not a small number. And that happens regardless of language, of background, of educational background of the parent. And it often it's more prevalent in little boys than in girls. And very often when you have a little boy who's affected by the specific language impairment, you can find out that the father or an uncle or a male member of the family had the same problem. Now, this is also important from a sort of educational perspective, because sometimes when teachers, kindergarten teachers, encounter bilingual children in their practice and have to assess them, they don't know, did this child have too little exposure in a second language? Or is the child sort of delayed in all his or her languages? Is there specific language impairment involved? And many times parents can give provide pretty good information of how the child behaved early in childhood. Like was he or she a late talker? And were the patterns that he or she produced different from what older brothers and sisters said or younger brothers and sisters said? So parents are an important resource of information if you don't have the knowledge of the first language of that child. I mean, again, sort of a footnote on the situation in Germany. We have 200 and 220 different languages spoken in a larger city. So if a family goes to a pediatrician, it's very unlikely that, unless it's a very common language, it's very unlikely that the pediatrician will know anything about the first language. But he or she can ask, was the kid a late talker? Yeah, and was he late acquiring words? That means, did the child not have a vocabulary of about 50 words by age 2? Or was he or she late putting words together, which is also a good indicator of that. So all of these acquisition types may be affected, and multilingualism or bilingualism is not a cause of language impairment. And actually, research that has been done with simultaneous learners of first languages has shown that if you have a group of children who are affected by specific language impairment, but they are bilingual, like French and English, learning French and English, and if you compare them to SLI children, monolingual SLI children in French or in English, that the bilingual is still more advanced than the monolingual. So for a long time, if you had a child with a specific language impairment, the doctors, pediatricians, speech therapists would say, don't use more than one language at home. And nowadays we would say, well, please continue using the 2 languages at home. Yeah, so a reverse estimate of what should be the case. Okay, so now there are several challenges and tasks that really cut across all these acquisition types. And again, some of what I'm saying now will be pretty trivial, and you be aware of all this, so it's just a reminder. But an important reminder, especially when you talk to lay people, is that languages are no inheritable objects. Okay? I mean, even though we speak about heritage languages, I'm just seeing how I'm doing time-wise. Okay. Language is no inheritable object. So I can take my ring off my finger and give it to you and say, here, I give this to you, you can, your children can inherit it, etc. So that's an object, but we don't do this, can't do this with language. And so grammars are representational systems. They're very well hidden inside our heads, and each learner has to reconstruct them afresh and on the basis of the input he or she gets. So there's always some intergenerational discontinuity, and there's also inter-individual variation to be expected. And you can actually test this very nicely if you take idiomatic expressions and ask people of different generations how they interpret them. You see that they diverge in their intuition many times. Then this may be a bit more controversial, but all language acquisition, and prototypical, I mean sort of face-to-face acquisition in early childhood, involves some kind of language contact, because I mean the one you learn with or from hopefully knows the language better than you do. Yeah, so there is a discrepancy, and it's kind of an asymmetry, also a discrepancy between the person who provides you with the input and you. It's as I said, this is sort of a trivial point, but it is relevant because it's also a language contact situation. Normally, when we think of language contact, we think of languages like Georgian and English, or French and Turkish, or whatever. So we don't really consider that a learner's situation is some kind of an imbalance situation between a grammar that you don't have as a learner and your own grammar. Yeah. So yeah. Then there are also interesting production comprehension asymmetries, and not just in the expected direction. We typically assume that you comprehend more than you can say. But when we look at language acquisition, we also see that there are some areas where the reverse is the case. Like there are children, I show you this with German data, where we studied how children understand WH questions. And at the time when they ask diverse WH questions, they still have problems interpreting them and figuring out the argument that's being asked for. So it's very systematic, and I can show you that on the basis of large-scale experiments and tests that we've done. Yeah. So asymmetries that in some areas go against what you expect to happen. Yeah. Although children sometimes understand quantifiers very differently from what you would expect. Yeah. Then what you are all familiar with from your sort of what you have done in acquisition or learned about acquisition, are the classic problems. The learnability problem. How come we know so much even though our input was so limited or deficient? Then the bootstrapping problem, which I think is very interesting, because even assuming that universal grammar helps you get off the ground, or helps you, you still need to figure out first some way of analyzing the pattern to an extent that then universal grammar can hold. Let's take an example. If you look at subject-object asymmetries, or look at sort of constraints on extraction of constituents. So you have to know, you have to have identified the constituent first. Or you have to know which of the constituents is a verb phrase or is the verb before constraints can hold. Think of constraints that you may be familiar with, like subjacency, constraints on extraction. So you need to have a way of cracking the system to an extent where then universal grammar can be relevant. Yeah, so there must be very powerful cognitive mechanisms pre-analyzing the strings, the primary linguistic data, to an extent where universal grammar can then do its job. And so the nice thing about the bootstrapping problem, or this kind of problem, is it's very democratic. It affects all theories. You know, they all have to explain how, I mean, the generativist has to explain how a string gets pre-analyzed to the extent that then universal grammar can work. Okay, so again, what else can we say about all acquisition types? So clearly, learners have to figure out the relevant features for many coexisting levels. You know, the phonology, prosody, whatever, you're all familiar with that. And these features that we require or we posit for different levels, they may be spelled out with different degrees of transparency or visibility. Maybe very abstract. You know, how do we discover abstract empty categories, for instance? Yeah? So we'll come to examples of that in the next session. Then learners have to work out the interfaces between all these coexisting levels. And you may know that the notion of interface has become very, very prominent in linguistic theory, and it makes interesting predictions about speed of acquisition and stages of acquisition. I'll be talking about that. And to some extent, I mean, the learners, even though they may be, since they're confronted with a lot of variation in the input, somehow they must be stubborn. They must remain convinced that there is something to be learned about this variation, that it's not just anything goes, but there may be a principle behind it, and that there may be abstract concepts to be reconstructed. I try to demonstrate this on the basis of just a simple example. So the learner must somehow believe that this would be part of the general cognitive mega, that variation in form matters. And this is very much like an early principle of contrast, which Eve Clark proposed, especially for the acquisition of word meaning, or matching form to word meaning. And so the principle of contrast, so the learner must be convinced if there is a contrast to be perceived, maybe it's relevant. And not just anything goes, I can do it, I can leave it, and whatever. So, and the types of variation that matters, and that would be, for instance, string internal correlation. So, for instance, I have a German example here, a third person masculine subject and the corresponding ending for a third person in the present tense. Sort of he goes, a du gehst would be the second person pronoun, and the second person inflection. So, but it's an string internal correlation for agreement, subject-verb agreement, it's string internal. So pay attention to what co-varies within the string, a relatively simple principle. You don't really need to know a lot about universal grammar to do that, but you have to be convinced that variation matters. And then you have string external variation, where what matters is sort of, in order to decode tense and aspect, you have to relate specific forms to the context, systematically related to context. That would not be string internal. That would be sort of information within a string and the outside world. But this is just an example to show you what I mean when I say that learners somehow need to be convinced or stubborn enough that even though they hear a lot of variation, to not just think it doesn't matter, I can use it, I can leave it, I can add this or the other. They have to be able to reconstruct paradigms on the basis of this. And that takes a lot of sort of just cognitive detective work. Yeah. And it's not dictated by universal grammar, because there are a lot of languages that don't show these inflections, they don't have pronouns, they sort of, or they're abstract features, etc., where nothing can really be correlated in terms of clear visibility. This is just sort of an example. But I will be talking about how kids develop sort of agreement marking, the functional features going into agreement and tense, for instance. And sometimes the correlations can go wrong, yeah? As in this humorous cartoon, where the little girl, that's her assumption about the pragmatics, she tells her brother, when somebody gives you something, you wait for them to say, and what do you say? And then you say, thank you. A correlation with the outside world, right? Particular form correlates with a specific speech act or specific time in the environment in which you say something. Very different from the adult perspective. But when you look at this, you say, yeah, of course, kids could reach that conclusion. Yeah. Okay, so let me sort of come to, actually I may even be able to end in time, I just want to stress some few aspects and go a little bit about beyond acquisition now, but also mention an asset that we have, and that's, in my opinion, not really used often enough when we teach children. And it's something that's very cheap to have. It's just the enjoyment with language, for instance. So, I mean, from our perspective, thank goodness, I mean, from the linguist perspective, the world is really a giant language lab with endless opportunities for studying language contact phenomena and language acquisition. And usually speakers are very willing to speak to us. Children are extremely cooperation partners. And so it's really very interesting work. And also I found that when I did my own research, first for my dissertation, I was a most welcome babysitter. When I showed up with my recorder, that meant that the parents could take off for a few hours because, I took over. So there was, I think it worked very well in both directions. I got my data and high quality time with the children, and the parent could disappear for a little while. I'd like to remind you of something that Pim Lefeld once said. He says that we Homo sapiens are fanatic speakers, that we are constantly busy with language. Language is ubiquitous. And let's not forget that language is one of the most complex activities or speaking is one of the most complex activities, or comprehending as well, that we are capable of. There are social factors, cognitive factors that enter the picture, and of course questions of identity very, very strongly. And we'll see this when we talk about bilingualism. And then Pinker also says this very nicely, we're verbivores. Now what's also interesting in these two examples, you have borrowings in there, right? The Latin, the educated, borrowing here the Latin, Homo sapiens, and then you have verbal play. Verbivore doesn't exist, but everybody knows it's herbivore. If you know herbivore, of course you need to know herbivore, but then you sort of crack the verbivore. So it's language play. we engage in. And so I hope to be able to show you how early children, monolingual and bilingual, will be engaging in some verbal play, and also the bilingual sort of indicating early metalinguistic awareness, as in this first anecdotal example that I gave you before. So language is not just ubiquitous, but also fun, and it's free. You know, I mean, that's really amazing. Nobody teaches us to comprehend jokes. I mean, we may be better or worse individually in grasping irony. Yeah, people differ in the extent to which they can deal with ironical comments, but there is this sort of the basis of using some kind of a contrast that we realize spontaneously on the basis of the grammars that we have and the lexicon that we have. Sort of that's really something that's to be used, especially when we teach children. Let me give you an example from Mary Poppins. I think I got the name wrong, but you may know this. So speaker A says, I met a man with a wooden leg named Smith. And then the speaker B say, and what's the name of the other leg? Huh? Yeah, so if you just hear the first utterance, you don't get that ambiguity. But then when you see the second one, you immediately realize what's happening here. And you have the analysis. But English has these wonderful relative clauses where you can drop, you can sort of drop the relatives, the object relative, and you can then drop the verb as well, the finite verb. And then you get an ambiguous sentence. Yeah? A man with a wooden leg, where the wooden leg is the antecedent, or where the man, that's clearly the other interpretation, the standard interpretation. But you see how this humorous effect sort of is there. And this is sort of, I was sent this last Christmas, a linguistic insider joke, where you have the honey, the woman says, it's the relatives that come for Christmas. The relatives that can be a nuisance, where visiting relatives can be a nuisance. And then here it's the relative pronouns, the which, that, and who that enter the picture. So you have to be a linguist to appreciate this kind of humor. And then, of course, if you think the visiting relatives can be a nuisance, if you know this famous sentence by Chomsky, then you also have a totally different sort of intertextuality associated, a different text evoked. Not just the linguistic knowledge, but sort of the text evoked. I have an example from a Yule book on pragmatics here too, where the wife says to the husband, Mr. Brown always kisses his wife when he leaves, why don't you ever do that? And then the husband says, well, I just don't know her that well. Yeah, so the question is sort of who's supposed to be kissed, yeah? And sort of you see what the husband takes as an antecedent in this case, And I have a last example here, which it's very appropriate in terms of how children sometimes interpret what we say, where the father shows a picture to the child and says, your grandma, and the kid says, no, I'm not, I'm Jeffy. Yeah, the possessive pronoun versus, pronoun, subject pronoun, and a criticized copula. Yeah. So again, from a child's perspective, makes perfect sense. So, concluding sort of, what do linguists have to offer? What linguists have to offer? I mean, this is an obligation, I think, that we have. After all, the world gives us the data, so we have some reason to sort of be thankful and give our knowledge back. And in the ideal case, sort of, we do something which a linguist colleague of mine, Jürgen Lehnertz in Cologne, he said, as linguists, we operate on the open brain. It sounds gruesome, but what he means is we want the linguist's mind to be open. I mean, we all know, you're very young, a lot of you, but you're old enough to have seen theoretical changes, and you'll be seeing more. So we also need to be open about our own errors, and hopefully we'll improve the theories that we have so far and get better ones. So we have to be remain open, and I think it's our obligation to make sure our societies remain open to changes that are relevant for them. I mean, languages are relevant, and teaching language and learning languages is important for our societies. Then our work has very practical implications for developing valid diagnostics, curricula, interventions, and also evaluation studies. And that also is a good point, I find at least, for strengthening our proposals for funding research. Yeah, at the moment, there are a lot of research organizations that fund projects dealing with phenomena or dealing with projects that claim that they can improve language teaching and what happens in schools, for instance. Then, of course, as if we do our job well, we also qualify as good research partners for cross-disciplinary research corporations. A lot of us are involved, doing psycholinguistic work, neurolinguistic work, and so we are already involved in this. And then, finally, we can also show why language support is costly, and research is costly, given the many variables involved, especially if you need control groups, and you need, not just a couple of participants, but you need a number of participants. And finally, we also need to consider that sort of a metaphor that's very prominent in many European countries, that language is the key to integration. That is true, but what's forgotten is that some integration into a meaningful communicative network is the key to language learning. So you have to create the conditions first, you have to integrate first, basically, and then language acquisition follows. So I think we need to convince our knowledge societies that it takes more than telepathy to provide good learning environments. I think that our politicians still expect the learning to happen like a miracle. And that's why I sort of often provocatively say, it's more than telepathy that we need to be involved in. Now, one absolutely final point, we should not forget that when we look at this area, this new area, the impact transfer area, whatever you want to call it, we're also creating new job opportunities for our students, for the future, for the linguists that we are now working with us. And I've seen this in Germany, that a lot of the linguists that we've trained now work with foundations, or they work with cities, they are turned into consultants for language development. And so I think there is a whole new development in terms of career tracks that are being created. And I think the same is probably true in other countries as well. I have students who now go out and teach, kindergarten teachers, or work as partners in schools with teachers. And so in general, there are new tracks that I think should not be underestimated, and hopefully will also, the tracks will be deepened and also be paid better in the future too. So thank you very much for your attention. That's it.
There will be a drive for all the readings and lectures. So if you want access to the drive, send me an email. Several people already did. If you haven't sent me an email, please do so, and I will add you to the drive. And then you can see the lecture slides and also the readings. There will be 4 folders for each professor. So for Professor Tracy, for myself, for Carlo Cicchero, and for Leah Nash. And so each of those folders will have the readings. We also want to see if you want us to add something. So if there's a particular reading you need, or if there is something that you would like us to cover in the lecture, let us know. If you don't want to speak up in class, that's fine. Send me an email. All right? The second housekeeping announcement has to do with a slight change in the lectures. Unfortunately, I have to leave Thursday morning. So on Wednesday, I will take Leah Nash's syntax slot. So there will be 2 lectures on experimental work on Wednesday. One will be the first lecture in the morning. The second will be the first lecture after lunch. And then on Thursday, you're going to get 2 syntax lectures, okay? So I'll keep making this announcement because people keep changing. So that's about it. Any questions? Okay, so then let's start. And just like Rosemary, I want to know what you want to know. So feel free to interrupt me, feel free to make suggestions, because I don't know the audience and I would like to make sure that I understand what you guys want. But the goals of what I'm going to do in the next 4 lectures is to think about how you think experimentally. I can't teach you everything and every trick, but my hope is that we can figure out how to think about experimentation, and also to learn some very basic things about experimental approaches and their use. And here the bottom line is there is no single experimental approach that's perfect. They all have their problems. You can't do everything. And so what you want to do is maximize the effort, because you want to try and do what works best for your research question. So that's kind of the main thing. So you don't have to be an engineer and learn fMRI and all the other fancy stuff that I'm going to talk about. You want to first start with a question. That leads me to the most important slide of everything I'm going to say today. And that is, when you forget everything that we've talked about, what you need to remember is that there is no experimental linguistics. There is theoretical linguistics, which then uses experimental methods. So in order to do interesting experiments and meaningful experiments in linguistics, you first start with a question. If you don't have a question, you can have the fanciest machinery and it's not going to work for you. Okay, so that's the contract between you and me. All right? So in order to think experimentally, you need to know theory first. And there is no good experimental work without serious questions about language. I'm going to show you good experimental work. If you want some examples of bad experimental work, let me know. I can talk about some hypothetical bad experiments. Nobody has done bad experiments, so we're not going to badmouth anybody, but I can tell you, give you some examples of what shouldn't be done. And as many people, I get to review a lot of stuff on experimental work, and often I get a proposal or a paper, and the first question in my mind is like, why did you do that? Why did you waste 4 months of your time and your grant money to do something that's very obvious? So let's try and avoid that trap, okay? So here's how we're going to proceed. I don't know how much I will be able to do today, but that's my plan. So we're going to start with the competence-performance distinction. Then we're going to talk about experimental methods, and then the overview of a research process. So that, again, will take me back to this pet peeve of mine that you need to know theory, you need to ask the right questions first, okay? So here's your experimental research process. You'll be seeing this slide a number of times. And basically, what you do is you start with your hypothesis, okay? So you have a question, you have a hypothesis, that's your starting point. Once you have your hypothesis, then you decide, okay, based on my hypothesis, I'm going to run a particular experiment, and this is where you ask yourself, why do I need to run an experiment? If the answer is I don't know, you don't run. Then if you have created the design, you do the data collection, which is the least difficult part. The hardest part are the hypothesis and the design. Then you have a little break when you do data collection. Then you do analysis and interpretation. That's a hard part. And then if your experiment is interesting, you may actually be able to update your theory. So this all goes in a circle. So like I said, I will be using this slide a number of times, and we'll talk about that in greater detail. So let's talk about how we go from theory to experimental design. Before I go on, am I going too fast? Everyone is with me? Fine? Okay, feel free to interrupt me. So we're going to talk about competence versus performance. So competence is essentially the mental representation of language in the speaker's head. And competence is completely unaffected by independent conditions such as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention, or shifts of interest, errors. Like, for example, we know that language is inherently recursive. So you can put items of language inside other items of language, and you can create infinite recursion. That's the part of competence. If I started doing infinite recursion right now, I would probably run out of breath and run out of effort in about 7 embeddings, right? So that's the limitation, which has nothing to do with the structure of language. It has everything to do with external circumstances. So we're all trying to figure out what competence is, what is the mental representation of language in the speaker's head, and that has long been the focus of theoretical linguistics. And initially, it was based on assessment of what we call offline data. So you come up with a sentence, you think, oh, okay, that's an interesting one. What do I think about that? And then traditionally, you go ask a couple of your friend linguists. Linguists generally have very good imagination. And so they will say, oh, no, I don't like your sentence. Then you're not happy, you go to another linguist, like, maybe she'll like my sentence. And that's kind of created this image of linguists who just go fishing for the right judgments. And once they get the right judgments, they stop. And typically, this kind of image of those theoretical linguists who just go for small grammaticality judgments has led to great interest in corpora. And when we're going to talk about experimental methods, you will see a lot of emphasis on the corpora. We're going to talk about why corpora are good and what are the limitations of corpora. But basically, the focus of theoretical linguistics is this mental representation of language. We're trying to build a model. And I think all the models we have are not as good as the model of a language in the head of a 2-year-old, what Rosemary was talking about. So we're not there yet. We're probably at the level of a 6-month-old, although we think that our models are so great, but we're not. And the catch is that when we build our model of competence, we base it on performance, because we can't really open someone's head and figure out what's going on. So the focus of experimental work, which divides into psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics, is the assessment of what people do with language in real time. That's called online. And the understanding of how we can use those online data in order to make judgments about offline, about the mental representation. So we always go about competence in a roundabout way. There's no other way so far. And so competence and performance are often connected. And one of the challenges in more experimental work is to separate what's performance, what's competence. I mean, it all looks fine and dandy on this slide, but in real life, it becomes a little more challenging. So that's our basic distinction, okay? So in psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic studies, we try to bridge the gap between the models of mental processes and the models of what goes on in an online situation. So that's the utility of what people call experimental linguistics. I told you in the beginning that this course is called Experimental Approaches to Syntax, so I can talk about a few interesting studies in phonology, but that's not my area. So of course I feel much more comfortable talking about syntax and morphosyntax because that's what I know. And actually, there has been more progress done in those areas. But what we call experimental syntax or experimental linguistics is 2 branches, neuro and psycholinguistic approaches. So this is just a little idealization. So what you see on the left is a very, where's this? Okay, is a very old representation of a syntax tree. Can someone tell me why it's very old? Yes, and how can you tell? Yeah, so we're not, well, there's no X bar, and then notice that the top node is labeled S, which is the 1970s. Now it should be IP and TP, right? Reflecting the idea that all phrase structure is uniform. Okay, so this is a very old picture. It is actually drawn from the work by Tom Bever, who was one of the people who started this whole link between experimental and theoretical work. Okay, so we have our little GB3. Oops, no, come back. And then we have various areas in the brain. So if you see the brain like here, I'm going to talk about that in lecture 3. That's how I planned it. I may not get there until lecture 4, but we'll see. And then you also see the brain waves, which we're going to talk about hopefully tomorrow, depending on how we go and what you guys want to hear. Okay? And so the question is, how do we go from the right, which is performance, to the left, which is competence? And you can see that actually our access to performance is a little more sophisticated, more modern than the model which I'm showing you here. Okay. So one of the questions we have to address when we talk about competence versus performance is whether or not the competence and performance operate on the same principles. That's called a single model. Or whether performance is guided by completely different principles and mechanisms. And this is the dual model. So the question is, okay, I have my mental representation, and my performance is the same as my mental representation. However, it's limited by, how much oxygen I have in my lungs, how much attention I can spend. These are the external factors, but they are all the same. The alternative is that we have a model of competence, we also have a model of performance, and there's a filter that goes between those two. That's a dual model. The debate hasn't been really settled. There seems to be a little more evidence in favor of the single model, but I don't want you to think that the single model has won. So my kind of suggestion is that when you look at experimental work, every time you address it in your readings or in the work you want to do, ask yourselves this question. Do these results indicate that we're looking at a single model, or are we looking at a dual model? So the idea then is to make it a little more explicit, whether or not we have one or two cognitive systems responsible for language. So if we have one system, again, it's all about performance limitations. If we have two cognitive systems, then there has to be some kind of an interface between the cognitive system which drives your performance and the cognitive system that drives your mental representation. So if we go with the dual system, with the idea that there is one system for competence, the other system for performance, then we basically have what you see in the square on your left. So my performance on this clicker is terrible. So that probably argues in favor of a single model. Okay, so what I'm trying to do unsuccessfully is to show you the square and the rough. So there is some kind of a rough and ready representation. So if you have something like, the dog chased the cat, we have the first noun phrase, which is the agent. This noun phrase initiates the chasing, and then the cat appears, and the cat undergoes some action. And so what you do is you just go with the string as you hear the items. And it's all primarily linear, and because it's linear and the language is actually hierarchical, we know that independently. What you have to do is to create a filter. And so with that filter, you go from something more complex to the separate cognitive system for language processing. There's a very nice paper by Townsend and Bever on that, and you can see that it's not very old, it's 2001. Have people read this paper? Has anyone seen that paper? Okay, so maybe I should put it in the folder and you guys can take a look. Because, I can't give you all the information in 4 lectures, but I can at least show you the references. And you can evaluate the arguments for yourselves. Okay? The second approach is that we have just one cognitive system. So if I have something like John believes that Mary loves Bill, it's not like, John is the agent of the action of believing, and then Mary loving Bill is the theme, but rather you have this more complicated, detailed grammatical representation. You start with, okay. Okay, you start with John, and then you have the believing, and then you have this whole CP, which is, that Mary loves Bill. And so basically, you have one cognitive system which encompasses both language structure and language processing. And it goes under the motto, parser is grammar. And so one of my colleagues, Colin Phillips, is one of the most relevant people in this kind of paradigm. And again, I will be happy to put in the folder this new paper, fairly new paper by Siobhan Lewis and Colin Phillips, where they argue that a good way to distinguish between these two approaches is to look at the comparison of offline and online data. So if we see that we're going to have alignment and misalignment between online and offline data, that can somehow inform our understanding of how performance and competence work. Offline is just judgments. So I come up with something. Online is how you process things in real time. Okay? And we'll see more of that. So now it's probably a good place to talk about what linguistic data we use. So I started with this whole idea, back to your question about judgments. And people were very unhappy with some examples. There's a famous paper by an English linguist, Eva Dubrovska, which is called The Language Acquisition Device Goes to School. So what she did, she took a bunch of sentences from one of the premier journals, Linguistic Inquiry, and she showed those sentences to professors, graduate students, undergrads, and janitors in the British university where she was teaching. And turned out that the professors were okay, like 70% of the sentences were accessible. The grad students were somewhere in between. The undergrads were failing, and the janitors just said, well, this is total rubbish. And so her point is that because a lot of English speakers, all of these people were native English speakers, could not deal with those sentences. These are all figments of linguistic imagination, and so this is not language. Okay? And so that's an interesting way of approaching it. What does this show? It basically shows that when we deal with complex linguistic data, literacy, training, and analytical experience are relevant, so that matters. But whether or not this somehow denies that we have a mental representation is a little more dubious. You had a question, right?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question very further regarding to the topic you said about single or double model. I wanted to say, if we're talking about syntax that leads to Chomsky and universal grammar, and one of the most important aspects of that is economicity, then having one system hypothesis is more economic than two. Right.
Yeah, so that's an important consideration.
In favor of having one model, it's more economic.
Right. So what you're saying is that we need what's called parsimony or economy, right? Because we want our models to be elegant. But the people who come from the other side of the square, the people on the left, they will say, well, we just don't have a good appreciation of how much a human brain is capable of. So what looks parsimonious to you and me may actually be too simplistic. So we know that there's a lot of so-called parallel processing. And so if we accept parallel processing, you can have a parsimonious system for competence, another parsimonious system for performance, and some kind of a linking rule. And so that in itself won't be such a big problem. What we will lose is the beauty of our model, but who said that the models have to be beautiful? So we have to sort of separate parsimony in the representation and the parsimony in the model. But yeah, that's a very good point. And in an ideal world, we want to take it as an argument for single model. Yes, please.
So what is their answer to, for example, configuration of the, which is proved in many languages? What is the answer of these groups?
So again, This group would not deny that syntax is arranged hierarchically, but when you perceive it, when you are in performance domain, everything is linear, everything is fairly flat, and then you have to go through this filter and work on creating the hierarchical system. It's more work, yeah. So, well, let's see. I mean, sometimes maybe more work is good. So, I'm trying to, well, I certainly have my own preferences, but I'm trying to make sure that we take both of these models seriously and see what arguments we can find. And you'll see some interesting cases in a moment. Okay? Shall we go on? All right. So we have a lot of what we call descriptive data, which include corpora, which include interviews and surveys, phonological analysis of recordings, extremely important in child language, where you don't always know what the child says. That's why, you know, people who work on child language deserve appreciation and admiration, not just because they can deal with 2-year-olds, but also because they have to learn Elan and Esmeralda and all the difficult things. You have to have video transcripts. Let's talk about corpora. So we now live in big data. It's easy to search for everything. What's good about corpora? Tell me what do you think is good about the corpus? Real examples from real life. Mm-hmm. What else?
We can get access to something like heritage languages.
Mm-hmm. So we can see spontaneous speech. We can see speech which may have not made it through the brain of an educated linguist. What else?
Sometimes we can call it both positive and negative samples, positive and negative examples.
Mm-hmm.
Negative, I mean that if we want to prove something, we have something counterexamples.
Right, yeah, very good. We find counterexamples to our generalization. So for example, in modern American English, there is this new construction, well, relatively new, which is called double is, which people say the thing is. And you ask any English speaker, they say, no, I don't say that. And then you listen to the corpora and everybody says that. It started in the 1960s. So that's an example of like language change, new things. Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. So diachronic change. Okay.
Sometimes we doubt if, for example, this structure is right or not. But when we look at the corpora, we see that there's no right or wrong. There's a variation.
There is, yeah. We see a lot of variation. Okay, which is good and bad, because if you see a lot of variation, the point is, well, maybe it will never stop, and you still want to constrain it. Tell me what we may be missing if we just concentrate on corpora. What is it that you'll never get from corpora?
Korean competence for online.
Okay. What else? You know how linguistic data are always organized into minimal pairs? Something is possible, something is impossible. You're not going to get impossible comparisons. So you're not going to get, you'll get some speech errors, but what you don't get in corpora is so-called negative evidence, not negative in terms of your hypothesis, but negative in terms of whether something is impossible. So corpora do not include impossible things. Okay? So that's one of the drawbacks. The other thing is that corpora may not include things which are very rare. And very rare things sometimes have some importance as well. So we don't always go by frequency. And in fact, if you study processing literature, you see a lot of interesting examples of how frequency doesn't work, or doesn't always work. So this is what's missing in corpora. And so there seems to be this kind of constant tension between people who insist on working on corpora and people who insist on working on so-called artificial judgments. So as a generative person, I always hear, oh, you deal with artificial judgments. And I think we need to do both. It's sort of like, imagine, I'll give you the metaphor. Imagine that you want to study how the physiology of running works. So you can take a very experienced Olympic runner and see how they run. But then you can take people like me who don't run very well, but I still run, and so you want to know how my running works. And so you want to be responsible for both. And so by saying I'm only going to look at corpora, or I'm only going to look at artificial elicited judgments, you are just studying a subset of runners. And so you're missing certain generalizations. So we're far away from what physiologists do. Yes, please.
You're working on syntax, and in formal syntax, formal linguistics, it is said that there is no room for corpus.
Mm-hmm.
Formal linguistics starts from Chomsky.
Well, formal linguists use corpora all the time. Like if I want to know what people use, I go through the corpus. It's very easy to search. The problem is I can get a lot of data for English, German, or French. You go to less developed corpora, even Russian. Russian has a corpus, but the corpus is terribly tagged. You get an enormous amount of noise. So it's not as well organized as COCA. For Georgian, for example, there are 3 corpora right now. Not all of them are tagged, so you're going to get a very limited amount of data. So depending on your language, you will have to do more or less by hand. You will see less or more through the information. So that's another kind of downside of corpora. But I think it's an illusion that generative linguists do not deal with corpora. They do. We always look at that. We just don't use that as the end point. Okay? So this is our descriptive data. And again, back to what we were talking about in the beginning, when you forget everything. And remember one thing, we always start with descriptive data, because the descriptive data give us some foundations for a hypothesis. Then we can go to behavioral data. And behavioral data include both online and offline methods. And here there is a little bit of a problem with terminology, because remember I said that theoretical linguistics deals with offline data, and that meant basically what our intuitions are. And here we can also talk about offline data, but they include things like acceptability judgment, grammaticality judgment, completion tasks. So I can give you something written on paper and ask you to rate it, and I won't time you. And that's very often done in work with, for example, with heritage speakers, because these poor people cannot operate under time pressure. So you want to give them offline tasks. And so that's one of the types of behavioral data, typically very easy to collect, especially now with electronic platforms, and a very good source of data. And then there are a lot of time course interpretations where you have what's done online, self-paced reading. We're going to see some examples of that. Eye tracking, again, I'm going to show you some examples of eye tracking. So-called speed accuracy trade-off. So you're given a lot of material very quickly, and we see how people operate under pressure. So I'm giving you a sentence, and you have to judge them. Okay? And you will see a range again. So you will see how native speakers do better than non-native speakers, how children do worse than adults, and so on. Then there is so-called cross-model priming. You're reading a sentence, and at the same time you're hearing something which interferes with your reading. And then various visual world paradigms, which we're going to see. And then, of course, then comes the physiological or neurophysiological stuff, which is the fancy stuff. That's what everybody wants to do, very often for bad reason. Because, you know, it's like there is no glamour in doing acceptability judgments. But there seems to be a lot of glamour in doing brain imaging. But again, to sort of preview what we're going to see, our models of language are actually way more sophisticated than the neurophysiological, neurological images, neuroimaging indices that we associate with the brain. We're going to talk about that tomorrow, and you will see that I can build you a very complicated syntactic tree, but there are like 4 brain responses that we use to talk about this tree. So that's where our model, our competence model, is either too complex or ahead of what we have here. So this is glamorous because the toys are new. You look like you're doing something serious. But again, think before you do that. Okay? So these are the main linguistic data, and so some of these can again be divided into offline methodology and online methodology. So corpora, questionnaires, which could be sociolinguistic questionnaires, could be completion tasks, could be grammaticality judgments. These are all offline methods. Okay, you can have very sophisticated things here as well. You can certainly put it in a computer platform. That's not a big deal, but these are considered offline tasks, so you're giving your subjects more time. And then there are all these online methods, which include both behavioral and physiological. And just sort of a quick note, when you want to do imaging, if you want to do imaging, you never start imaging right away. You always have a behavioral study before the imaging study. So there are some studies where they didn't do that, and the results are typically quite disastrous. So what we're going to do is look at some cases of alignment and misalignment between what happens online and what happens offline, because that will help us address those two square boxes that we saw earlier. So I'm going to throw some data at you, some material, and we'll see whether or not these materials actually help us argue in favor of the dual model or the single model. So the idea behind alignment cases is that when we build online language processing, we're guided by the same exact principles that we use when we have a grammatical representation. So we expect the alignment to go that way. And then what we have is if we're using the single model, then online measures allow us to quickly notice any kind of grammatical anomaly and quickly allow us to avoid ungrammatical parses or ungrammatical interpretation. Okay? So these alignment cases basically support this idea that parts are in grammar. The misalignment will be mismatches between online measures and offline representation. And the idea is that you have your competence representation, which says, you know, build your tree the following way, and then your online representation goes a different way, and so you get a mismatch. Okay? So let's take a look. We will see just a few quick alignment cases. So how many people here can read Georgian? Most everybody, right? Okay. So I hope I didn't make a mistake in the slide, but if I did, please correct me. So we're going to look at one alignment case, actually, binding constraints. I'm not going to present islands, I'll just mention it. And then we're going to look at several interesting misalignment cases, garden paths, comparative illusions, center embedding, agreement errors, and probably I won't do NPIs. Okay. So the idea is that when you bind, when you have a noun or some kind of a referential expression that's connected to another expression, which can be only identified based on the previous expression, that's the nature of binding, then what you do is you follow certain constraints, and those constraints apply online. And so that means that only grammatically accessible antecedents are considered. So if I say, Mary hit himself, what's wrong here? Mary hit himself. Mary is a woman, we should expect herself, right? So we expect that Mary will be binding the word self, and we immediately see that there is a mismatch in the gender, so our parser rejects that, no problem, right? And so the idea is that there are certain online preferences. So the example I gave you is very, very simple. So Mary hit himself is bad because we know that we violated a particular representation. Let's look at a slightly more interesting case where we're going to look at co-reference between a referential expression and a pronoun. So let's read this. The squadron paraded through town. Every soldier who knew that James was watching was convinced that he should wave as the parade passed. Okay? So who's he? Every soldier? Could it be somebody else? Could be James, could be every soldier. Okay, who likes every soldier better? Okay, who likes James better? All right, let's see who's right. Okay, how do we test? So what I can do is I can create an antecedent which wouldn't match he. So if I replace James with a female name, with Helen, then it will be only every soldier, right? Or if I replace, every soldier with every woman, again, I will have some kind of I won't have any ambiguity, okay? So first thing we want to do is we want to remove the ambiguity, but we also need some hypothesis. And so the idea is, the reason I asked who prefers every soldier over James is that there are two possibilities. One is that whatever shows up first has preference. It's considered very salient, and so as I process, I'm going to peg all my effort to the more salient thing which was mentioned first. In addition, quantified expressions like every and all tend to be very salient. So there is like a double contribution here. That competes with another phenomenon that we know from language processing, and that is the recency effect. So James is much closer to he, and so if I don't want to spend a lot of effort going back, I will hit James before I go back to every soldier. And interestingly, more people raise their hands about James, but how many people are native speakers of English? Okay, what do you guys think? Every soldier, both of you. Okay, so what we have, we may be looking at some interference from our own language, our first language. Generally, native speakers of English do seem to favor the quantified antecedents, but let's see what happens, okay? So what we're going to do is we will have the matching case, the quantifier match, and the name match. It's the same sentences that you saw earlier, but just a smaller font. Can everybody see? Okay, now this is what we're going to compare that. The squadron paraded through town. Every soldier who knew that Helen was watching was convinced that he should wave as the parade passed. Okay, here we have no ambiguity. Okay, what do we predict? Let's make predictions. So if we operate on our two English speakers, they like every soldier with he. So which sentence do you think will be read faster? The one with James or the one with Helen? The one with Helen, because there is no ambiguity. Okay? If the recency effect is more important, which we saw from a number of people who may not be native speakers, then we would expect that which sentence will be read faster? The one with James, right? Okay, let's see what happens. So the one with Helen was read much slower. Okay? So I'm very sorry, Cass and Matt. Something's wrong with your grammar. But what this shows is that in this competition between the recency and the preference for quantified antecedent, we actually see a strong recency effect. Okay? And so this recency effect overlays the general structure of the grammar. So when you see the word he, what you need to do, based on your compass, you need to look for a referential index, because he cannot be identified on its own. Okay? I actually had a colleague in fact in San Diego who would walk into my office and say, he just drove me nuts. And he wouldn't tell me who he is. So we had this very schizophrenic conversation where this colleague would start with a pronoun, and then it would take me about 3 or 5 sentences to figure out who this person was talking about. But so generally, pronouns require an antecedent, and so what we have here is a very simple binding principle. The pronoun is free, but it has to look back in order for us to know what it is. On that, we put preferences, and we saw that there were 2 competing preferences, and so this is a very nice, clever experiment where they did a very simple manipulation and were able to see how exactly the preferences line up. Now, we saw that we had 2 speakers here who actually didn't cooperate. So based on the judgments from our 2 American speakers, we were expecting the opposite. Okay? So what we need to do is to figure out what exactly happens in their grammar. Because a very easy way will be to say, okay, well, these people just will dismiss them. Who cares? But you can't do that because speakers are often divided into subgroups. And so what you need to do is to identify some other properties in the internal grammar of those speakers who work this way, where the closest antecedent is more important, and those speakers who prefer the quantified antecedent. So we start with this initial observation that, there are these two groups, and then we have the next research question. What makes them prefer every soldier? What makes other people prefer James? Okay? We don't have a good answer here, but what I would do, like if I were following up on that experiment, I would try different types of quantified antecedents and see if there's something about every that these people may be fixated on. So that just shows that every experiment leads you to a new research question, which may be interesting. You had a question, right?
Yeah, I was thinking how about if you include visual information?
Yeah. So that's a very good point. So this is a self-paced reading study. It was very simple. We'll see how it's done. Usually after that, you say, okay, well, maybe we didn't have enough fine-grained measures. Let's do an eye tracking study or a visual world information. And then the question becomes, okay, let's say I had study with self-paced reading and I had an eye tracking study and they gave me competing results.
Yeah.
Then what do? I just say, okay, there's a problem with my methodology. Self-paced reading sucks. It doesn't usually work so badly otherwise. Or there may be some other factors. So basically what we have to say is, yes, if we use a very coarse measure and we get no results, we may try a finer measure. If we use two different measures and they compete, they give us different results, then we have to really explain what happens. But you're absolutely right, we can always have a follow-up. And if you go to conferences where people present experimental work, usually in the question period what everybody does is like, oh, why didn't you run experiment 8A where you would have done this and that? And so what you want to do is you want to look at the experiments on their own turf, not just add stuff, but there's always something you can add. Okay, here's my Georgian stuff. I hope I didn't make mistakes. Okay, so okay, let me show you the second sentence. So the first, this is the start. Okay, this is the prompt. And then I have two amitoms. Okay, and for those of us who don't read Georgian well, so this is the transliteration. Okay. So Georgian is much more interesting than, let's say, English because it has a lot of null pronominals. And so who is it that you won't vote for? Is it Beridze or Gilashvili? Beridze? Okay, everybody? Okay, so no hesitation. Okay, so what do we have here? It seems like Georgian doesn't work like the English experiment which I showed you a moment ago because Gilashvili is closer, right? And do you guys have any preference with mas or without mas? Is it the same? Uh-huh. Okay. And what about?
That's the same.
Same. Okay.
Because I'll show you
Okay. So notice that I haven't run that yet. So this is something we're hoping to run to see how pronominal interpretation works in Georgian. But just based on the audience, you can see that Georgian speakers seem to prefer subject co-reference. Okay. So, but because Georgian has a free word order, we can easily put Beridzem after Gilashvili and see what happens there. So you can immediately start setting up your conditions for Georgian. And this is just a very small illustration to show that in Georgian there is ample room for interesting experimentation, which could be very easily done. Okay. This is called pronoun antecedent association, and so it's basically the same exact design that I showed you with English, but nobody has done that with the pro-drop language of the Georgian type. People have done it with Spanish. And there the observation is that speakers generally like subjects better, so just like you had it, but it's only a tendency. So we'll see. Okay, if anyone wants to do a little study. I'm very happy. I'm just looking at how much time I have. Okay, are you all tired or still holding up? Yes.
It's right that we have scrambling, we can move the elements.
Yes.
But we have one underlying order, and if we change these elements, something may happen, like topicalization, polarization. So it changes.
Yeah, you might have a frequency effect. So if I were filling this up, notice that I put ukmehad before the verb, precisely because I don't want either Beridze or Gelashvili to be in focus. So ukmehad helps me because I can make it defocused. And so what I can do, I can put Beridze after ga kritika.
Maybe we should note that if this is principle B of binding, it
Uh-huh.
should be or A pronouns, yes, for the pronouns.
Uh-huh.
We should notice that if it works at the underlying structure or at the surface.
Right, yeah. So you need to do both. And you definitely need both the overt pronoun and the underlying pronoun. No, there was one person who said there was a difference between mas and no mas, right? Someone?
Yeah, actually.
Okay.
If it works for one of them, I mean, for the underlying form or for the surface structure, then if we change the place of, if we move an
Right.
object, then it should change.
Well, the question is how it moves.
Okay, can everybody see? Yeah. Okay. So that's your basic structures for Georgian. I assume the language is head final, right? So that's your object, that's your subject. All right? Let's do the earlier, so you're getting past this. Okay? So I can move this guy higher up. Okay? The question is where? Depending on the answer, it will be either a scrambling or a binding.
That will give you different binding results. Oh, thank you. Depending on where you move, you will either get what's called a scrambling, like in Japanese, so I can move it maybe in another IP position over here. Okay?
It adjoins to IP, but it's the A position.
It could be an A position, yeah. Or I can move it somewhere here, and then it will be an A bar position. Okay? Depending on what I did, I may get different binding results. You know, we know that A bar movement does not change in binding, and A movement does. So that's an open question. So you're right that we have some kind of underlying structure, and before we run an experiment, it wouldn't be a bad idea to figure out how Georgian scrambling works. Even if I wanted to do something like that, before I do that, I need to figure out what the verb is doing in Georgian. In the head final language, good luck figuring out if your verb moves. There are all these very, very complicated arguments for verb movement in Japanese, which are very, very anemic, very weak. And so the question is, what happens here? So we have three moving parts in the analysis. So I need to know which of my two DPs went somewhere, what happens to the verb, and finally, the third thing, the next thing is whether or not it's really movement as opposed to null pronominalization, because the language is deeply invested in null pronominals. You have lots of null pronominal elements, which means it's not like English or German where you really have to scramble. But even for German, like middle field scrambling, nobody knows what it is. It's like A and A bar. It's like slightly pregnant. It's like, it's a little A bar, it's a little A. You look at the arguments, they make partial sense. So here it's possible that none of what I showed here is correct, and in fact, what you have is something like this. No, sorry, I want a different DP. So let's say you have your object in the front. You may not have scrambled it. You may just have a base-generated object, which is then co-indexed with the null pronominal. Co-indexation is free, but co-indexation will give you additional processing load. And so that's just to show that no experiment will really tell you much. The only thing we'll be able to do with those Beridze and Gelashvili examples is to show whether Georgian speakers prefer the ergative or the nominative and manipulate the position, but that wouldn't inform us about the structure. Yeah? In order to figure out the structure, we'll have to do something linguistically more sophisticated. So it goes back to this idea that, in order to run an interesting experiment, you first need to know what your structure is. Okay? And I find Georgian immensely fascinating just because of this null pronominalization. There is so much going on, and we can do so many interesting things. And of course, I do a little work on heritage speakers. So once I know what's going on with native Georgians, I can give you very specific predictions with heritage speakers because they generally amplify the tendencies which we find in the baseline. So for example, in Spanish, I mentioned that Spanish speakers prefer subjects, but it's not categorical. In Spanish heritage speakers, it becomes categorical because these poor people cannot deal with optionality. And so we could expect something like that here, but we have a lot, someone has a lot to do. Okay, moving on. Any questions? Okay. So, I mentioned the island effects, but I didn't show you any examples. So island effects are, of course, quite numerous, and island effects have been studied quite extensively in processing literature. So things will be like relative clauses or weather clauses, and what we find invariably that when speakers encounter online violations of islands, they slow down. We also get some interesting neuroimaging signatures of island violations, which we will see tomorrow. And so we're pretty clear that island violations are a problem. What we don't know is whether or not we should explain those island violations through syntactic violations or some kind of thematic role misalignment or what's called contradiction in formal semantics. And we'll see tomorrow some of the relative clauses where we're going to look at possible explanations. But for now, let's take a look at misalignment cases. Remember, I brought them up because we are interested in seeing which of the models wins. And to preview, what you're going to see is some of the results actually don't tell us much. They just tell us what's going on. But each side can claim victory, can say, oh, I don't know what's going on. So let's take a look at garden path effects. This is the famous example. The horse raced past the barn, fell. What happens here? So you read the horse raced past the barn, and you interpret the verb to race as run around. And then you get to fell, and you realize that raced is not the main verb, but a participle. And so it means, and Rosemary had a similar example. So the horse that was raced past the barn fell. We leave out that, we leave out was, and we have this garden path effect. So what happens when you get to fell? You have to revise the whole material. And this is where we need to take into account a very important strategy that people use in processing. We are generally very impatient as hearers or readers. And that means that when we experience language, we try to make predictions as early as possible. You can see that when you read in your first language. You never read the whole word. Why is it so hard to read in a second language? Because we don't have enough lexical items. When you read in your first language, you're essentially making guesses. And what happens is that's how a lot of processing works. So you're making guesses, and if your guess goes wrong, it's like, okay, to hell with that, I'll live with that, because I'll make my revisions. But the revisions are not as expensive as spending all the time and waiting for everything. So processing is incremental, that's the key word, and it's very fast. So incrementality and high speed are typical of human processing. And that that sometimes comes at the cost of revision. And so this is one of those examples where I'm willing to pay for the high speed by making revisions. So this is where your readers perceive the sentence as ungrammatical once they get to fill, and then they revise, and then they say, oh, okay, I can see there is a grammatical parse. Okay, good. And there are a lot of them. You mentioned visiting relatives, so that's a different type. So visiting relatives can be a pain. It has two meanings, right? What are the meanings?
Means if you visit them, if they come to visit you.
Okay, yeah, so when you visit them, it's a pain, or if they come to visit you. So in one case, visiting is a gerund, in the other case, it's a participle. People have some preferences for one or the other, but we certainly see that. Okay, let's look at this one that's less common than the race. So, read the sentence. Okay? So, I bet most of you read while Anna dressed the baby, assuming that Anna was putting clothes on the baby, right? But then you keep reading and you realize that dressed means that Anna was putting clothes on herself. And the baby was small and cute and spit up on the bed. So again, what you have here is this garden path, because when people read this sentence, 60% people online say that Anna actually dressed the baby. So they get the garden path, the wrong reading, okay? And very often, even if people get the conflicting material, they actually insist on the wrong material, because again, that's a sign of this incremental processing and fast-paced reading. Okay, this is the famous case of comparative illusions. More people have been to Tbilisi than I have, okay? So it seems very normal, right? More people have been to Tbilisi than, and then you encounter I have, so that makes no sense. But in the beginning, people generally consider it grammatical, and then after reflection, they say, oh, this is wrong, right? And there are a lot of those so-called comparative illusions. What these comparative illusions show, that's one of the main arguments in favor of a single model. The idea being that, we construct the structure and then we populate it with lexical items, which is very compatible with the minimalist approach to syntax. And then the realization of the comparative illusion comes very late when we have already built the structure. Okay, this is your processing overload when you have a sentence which is generally comprehensible, but there is so much packed into that that at first you think that it's ill-formed. And the famous case is center embedding, which is never a problem for speakers of Georgian or, let's say, Japanese, but it is a problem for speakers of English because you have too many things. So let's take a look. I'm not going to read that. I want you to read it to yourselves. So what happens here? You have 3 head nouns, right? An apparently new speech disorder, a linguistics department, and our correspondent, right? And so you can parse it. You have an apparently new speech disorder has appeared. A linguistics department was affected by the speech disorder. Our correspondent visited that department. Okay? But for an English speaker, this is really bad. So Georgian speakers can probably come up with a very easy way to go around that. Okay? And this just goes on. That's a text which you will see on your slides. Those affected, our correspondent, a local grad student called, could hardly understand, apparently still speak fluently. Again, you can see 3 head nouns, and they're not working well. The cause, the experts, the LSA sent to investigate remains elusive. What people notice is that as you give readers more and more of those sentences, they actually become primed for that, and they start dealing with them a little better, right? I guess by the time you hit these last 2 sentences, you're probably satiated enough so you can deal with that. Okay? So what to do? If we don't change any lexical items, we make an excerpt easier to parse by, let's say, making pauses. I've given you a reading sample, but if you were reading it out loud, you would probably have particular pauses. Also, as soon as you replace some of the DPs by pronouns, it becomes much easier. And as I already mentioned, the excerpt will get much better if you translate it into Georgian or Japanese, the languages which allow center embedding. So this shows that center embedding is something that languages actually allow, and then there is just different tolerance for it depending on the language design. And English, because of its very rigid word order, has an extreme intolerance to center embedding, whereas in head final languages, center embedding is difficult, but it can actually get easier as we change actual words. So changing the words, changing lexical items indicates that we're not dealing with a syntactic problem, because syntax doesn't care about the lexical items until a certain point, okay? So these are more examples. So here you see the student who the professor that the council recommended disappointed, appealed the grade. This sentence in D is difficult, but it's totally grammatical. And if you look at E, you can see that there is a verb missing there, where I put the underline. And that missing verb makes it completely ungrammatical. So what happens is people look at a bunch of center embedding sentences like I've given you, and then they look at E, and at first they accept it. They just miss the missing verb. And so that means they're building structure as they go. And so that, again, is used as an argument for the single model. Let me look at one more. That's just a famous case, so I'm throwing some famous cases at you. This is the so-called agreement attraction. So the key to the cabinets are missing. What's wrong with the sentence? It should be the key to the cabinets is missing, right? Or the keys to the cabinets are missing, like in G. But the sentence in F is bad because your verb is agreeing with what? With the cabinets. So what you have is the phenomenon known as agreement attraction, where the noun phrase whose features have to be matched on the verb is actually separated from that by some other noun phrase. And the verb borrows those features from the noun phrase. So what happens here is, again, there is nothing here about the grammar. People recognize that, but people make a lot of agreement attraction mistakes. They're very common in natural speech. That's the same kind of recency effect that we saw with Helen and James. Remember where people were slower with Helen because they encountered he and they knew that the word before was Helen, so they were worrying where the antecedent of he is. So we're looking at the same thing. The main reason to choose these examples is that in English, agreement is only with subjects. So if I had a language which has agreement with other elements. Oh yeah, no, there was just sort of just the virtue of examples. But in this particular case, there is no other way for English because you won't get agreement elsewhere. In general, no, people do all kinds of things. But you're asking a very interesting question, that is, do we see any performance preference or dispreference for subjects? So we noticed with the example of every soldier that there may have been this desire to attach the pronoun or a null pronoun to the subject. Okay. There's also a very interesting study by Clark and Wasso where they looked at how people place disfluences. So when we speak, we pause. And in that study, they found, there was a very nice result, they found that the pauses, the disfluences, were not randomly distributed. There was mostly pausing after the topic. Then there was pausing after the subject, so people sort of separate them as a separate unit. And then there was much less pausing after the object or after the prepositional phrase. So subjects are, of course, special, but the special status can go both ways. They're special in some ways which makes them privileged, but they're also special in some ways which makes them disprivileged. So, for example, they're less accessible for some, they're subject islands. So they're, you don't want to think about subjects as always getting the best deal. Okay? All right. So these are just cases of misalignment. I'm going to skip the negative polarity item, and I want to go to the experimental design. So this is something I've already shown you. the offline methods which serve as the source of data and source of generalization. And then we have all these online data. And the question when we need to address when we look at online data is, what exactly are we going to measure and why? Okay, so that's the question you want to address. So what we do is we basically try to combine three types of models. We want to look at linguistic theory, which operates on categorical rules and constraints. So in syntax in particular, everything is black and white. It's yes, no. Syntax is not non-categorical. Then you have parsing models and strategies. This is where a lot of preferences come in, and so this is a different vocabulary than in syntax. And then finally, you have neurolinguistic models and some computational models, for example, neural networks and some other models which sort of imitate the brain, or they think they do. And so what we try to figure out is what kind of effort or cost goes into an online interpretation of linguistic material. And the question often is, can we quantify this effort? Just like with competence, we don't have direct access to it, so the effort or the cost is not directly quantifiable. And so what we do, we use particular physiological or behavioral measures which are proxies for the processing cost or effort. So we're trying to use them as an approximation for what the human being is doing. Okay, so here are some behavioral techniques. Many of you know them. So self-paced reading, very easy to do. There's also self-paced listening, which is useful if you're dealing with an unwritten language, but it's very artificial. So we actually tried to do self-paced listening on a language in Dagestan, and the results were disastrous because people kind of said it was very artificial. They use it a lot with children. So our colleague Theo Marinis is an expert on self-paced listening. With children, it's natural because they can't read. Eye tracking, we'll see some of that. Speed accuracy trade-off, I wasn't going to spend much time on that. It's not a very common technique, but if you're interested, I'm happy to put some tutorials online. And then cross-modal priming, I mentioned that already. And then for brain-related techniques, there are essentially three things. There's EEG, MEG, magnetoencephalography, and magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. And so most commonly people use EEG and fMRI. And there are now machines which allow you to do both. They're very expensive. So of those three, ERPs are cheap. I have a portable ERP, which we actually brought to Georgia a couple years ago. When I first was pricing it, it was 4 years ago. It was about $100,000, and I was like in a state of shock. And after I went through my state of shock for a couple of years and was ready to buy it, it was $15,000. And it's still a lot of money, but I had a grant, and so I'm just telling you the toys are becoming more accessible. fMRI is horrendously expensive. An hour costs $500, and there are no portables. Okay. Okay, so self-paced reading is basically you read words on a screen, and you read at your own pace. We all read differently. Some of us are very slow readers, some of us are very fast readers, and when we do self-paced reading experiments, we compare people not to each other, but to themselves. And then we average over people. And so what we do is we typically measure reaction time in milliseconds for every word. And then we also make sure that our readers are paying attention. So in order to make sure that they're not just pushing the button like this, we have to ask them clarification questions. So typically when you do self-paced reading, let's say you have, 60 sentences. After each 3 or 4 sentences, more or less randomly, you will ask a clarification question because that means that these people are paying attention. Okay, and then you throw out people who said the same thing. We ran a self-paced reading study a couple years ago in Korean, and we put it online. There is this wonderful tool called Amazon Mechanical Turk. So you can just put the study online, and people can access the study, and then you pay them. And suddenly we had a lot of, we did wrong was we did not limit the IP addresses to Korea. And suddenly it turned out that there were like so many Koreans in Pakistan, I wouldn't believe. So we got a lot of responses from Pakistan, and the experiment was basically, well, we just lost some grant money because we had to pay these people, but they were just pushing the buttons. So we got a lot of useless data. So lesson learned, next time we ran, we limited the IP addresses. But what you do in a self-paced reading experiment, you use the reaction time as a measure of processing effort. So let's see how it works, okay? So here you're sitting in front of the screen. You can do it anytime, and you push the button. Okay. Now this is the experiment where I only give you one word. The words before disappear. Typically, this is how it's done. Some researchers leave all the words. So by the time you reach the end of the sentence, you will have one measure reaction time per word. We can measure reaction time per word. Okay, but there's a downside to that, because then people start paying attention back to what they've already read. That's why the preferred way is what I just showed you. So once again. So, and then the question is, can we measure reading time per word? That's your clarification question. What do we answer? We have to say yes, because we just read that sentence. So if you were paying attention, you'll say yes. If you were not paying attention, you'll say no, your data won't be used. Okay, so this is something that is, it started as a very difficult experiment. It started, of course, with English. A lot of these experiments started with English. And then about 30 years ago, they ran the first experiment on Japanese. And when they got the results were astounding, because the Japanese readers were spending about 1,200 milliseconds per word, which is an eternity in reading times, because typically it's about 300 to 400 milliseconds per word. And so it turned out that the Japanese readers were just not used to that. Although they were all very literate, they could not do that. And so then they sort of introduced the paradigm, trained their subjects, and now if you look at Japanese self-paced reading, whether it's done in kanji or in kana, it's very similar to English, about 400 milliseconds per word. But self-paced reading, of course, is associated with literacy. It's very easy to get a bunch of American undergrads, put them in the lab, pay them $10, and they'll do whatever you want. In some cultures or in some languages, the language is used primarily as a means of oral communication, and so doing reading time studies on languages like that is fairly useless. So we ran a couple of reading time studies in Guatemala on Mayan languages, and then I ran a self-paced reading study in Avar, which is next door from here in Dagestan. And when I got the Avar results, I first thought that there was an error in the program, because the average reading time was 1,500 milliseconds per word. But then I realized that these people actually don't read. Avar exists in the written version, but nobody uses it as a written language. They almost always speak it. So when we got the results, I mean, they were fairly clean. I can show them probably on Wednesday. I can show those results. But what I realized is that I needed a different measure. So if you have people who can't read, then what do? You try to do something with visual stimuli. So we did picture matching study. And we got the exact same results, and we also ran a comparison where we did self-paced reading and picture matching on, I think it was either French or Russian. Oh, both. We did French and Russian, where we can be certain that speakers both read and use the language, and the results lined up very nicely, which means that if you cannot run a self-paced reading study, then you can design a picture matching study and use the reaction time as a proxy for a self-paced reading. But so the Avar result was a kind of wake-up call, which indicated that even if a language has a writing system, you need to know whether or not people actually read in that language. The same happened with Kakchikel, the Mayan language that we worked on. One is the largest languages in Guatemala, about 400,000 speakers. There are children's books, there are newspapers. They never read. And so we got huge reading times as well, and then we replicated that with picture matching. So before you, if you're working on an exotic language, before you embark on a reading time study, ask yourselves, will these people actually read? Or will it be a very artificial task? I think I saw a question.
Yeah,
Yes?
I was thinking now about listening. So if instead of reading, if they listen about how quick that they react.
Yeah, that's what we did. That's what we did.
Listening as well.
Listening. It was, yeah, they looked at pictures and they heard the auditory stimuli, and the pictures were ambiguous. So we did an experiment on relative clauses, and there was a picture with, like, let's say 2 animals, 2 cats, and there is a dog in the middle. And so you have the cat that's pushing the dog and the cat that the dog is pushing. And the question is, point to the cat that the dog is pushing. And what you do is you measure 2 things, just like with reading times. You measure accuracy and you measure reaction time. And you get the exact same result. So we've done that with Avar, Kakchikel, Quiche, and 2 Polynesian languages. So I've done it 5 times now, and the results always line up very nicely. Yes?
Excuse me. As I know, in some languages there's controversial issues about the exact underlying word order. And my question is about, I don't know whether this time, reaction time is practical to testing the word order, underlying word order or not.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. So the question is, let's say I have 2 word orders I want to compare. Okay? How do I do that? Because I have to find, everything has to match. When you run a self-paced reading study, you have to match. So that's a difficulty, for example, when people compare English passives and English actives. Because in English, of course, you know, the house was built and the house was built by John built the house. They have completely different word order. So what you have to do is something like John was building the house was being built by John. So there you can sort of line things up. So there is this issue of lining things up. If you can do that, and there is a difference in like 1 word or 2, then you can compare. Then there's an additional issue. In the example I just gave you, there's a frequency effect. We don't use John, the house was built by John very often. So if you get a slowdown, which you will, the question is, do you get the slowdown because of the passive or because it's a rare construction? So those are very difficult, but you're absolutely right that when we do reading time studies, I gave you this toy example, you always have 2 or 3 sentences and everything has to be in the same place. So you can't compare a sentence where the verb is in position 3 with a sentence where the verb is in position 5. Yeah. Now, in terms of the theoretically underlying word order, we're back to the pictures we drew. That depends very much on the language. So if you know what your language does, then you can be pretty certain that, you know, one of the word orders is more derived than the other. Adverbs are always a good signpost, so you can look at what the adverbs do. Okay?
That seems to me to be a very good criteria to prove which theoretical approach is better in these cases. Yeah?
For word order, self-paced reading is always a good start. It's nice to do sentence completion. So sentence completion is when you give people, let's say, 2 items or 3 and ask them, let's say you want to know where the verb goes. You give them, I don't know, yesterday the baker, and then they complete the sentence. And then can either say, yesterday the baker baked beautiful breads, or beautiful breads baked. And you can see, I don't know, 10 people put the verb last and 3 people put the verb second. That suggests, that doesn't prove, but that suggests that the verb final order in that language may be preferable. Whether it's the underlying one, we don't know, because often what's preferable is not the underlying one. There may be other factors. But typically the experimental progression is start with sentence completion, then do self-paced reading. Then if the results don't really show much, you can just stop, which wouldn't be a bad idea, or you can do something more fine-grained like eye tracking, reading with eye tracking. And I think that this will be my either next or close to next slide. So I wanted to flag a new experiment on Georgian. So we just coded one. And so those of you who are interested, you can take it. I will post the link. So you can just take a look at the experiment and let me know. It's a very simple kind of almost a toy experiment. So the Georgians among us, or Georgian learners among us, can try and take a look at that.
Adding the slides in the book, right?
Yes. Yeah, everything is there. And some of the readings. And so here is the eye tracking, back to your question. So very often self-paced reading is too coarse and we don't really get the right results. And so what we can do with eye tracking, we can have more fine-grained measures. Now, eye tracking can be of two sorts. It can be reading eye tracking or what's called visual world paradigm. And what we know is where people look, how long they look, and whether or not they go back. So that's called regress. So remember the sentences with Helen and James? So if you read the sentence with Helen, so was what every soldier knew that Helen was watching while he was waving, something like that. Clearly, by the time your readers get to he, they will go back and start looking at Helen and trying to figure out what's going on. Okay, so that's your typical regress. And what you have is incremental measures and cumulative measures. So we know that processing is incremental, but also because we can look at the progress and also combine things, we can see both incremental and cumulative measures. So what you have is, you have a picture, I don't know how well you can see, that's from eye tracking. Eye tracking is now very well developed. In the beginning, it was like a big bicycle helmet with a camera attached. Now, there are a lot of eye tracking which can be done on an iPad. And it's a very inexpensive thing. You just have to learn the technology. It's not hard to run it. It's not expensive. But very often, you just need to know what you're doing. And so there are some wonderful labs, like, for example, Rosemary's colleague Holger Hopp is one of the best eye trackers I know. So you can look at his lab and see what they're doing. In the States, I like the work which is done in Illinois. There are several eye trackers there. There's a very good eye tracking lab at CUNY Grad Center. And so there are some labs which do it extremely well. So if you just look at the range of what these people do, you can see some interesting projects. But basically, what you have is either reading, and I think that's what you suggested, like if self-paced reading didn't work, let's try eye tracking. It's a more sensitive measure. Or we have the visual world paradigm. Okay? So this is just how eye tracking works. So we have a sentence like, since Jay always jogs a mile, seems like a short distance to him. So it's one of your garden path sentences, right? So since Jay always jogs, then you think he jogs a mile. But then you get to see him, and what happens is you have to revise. So that's where your arrow goes, and you're doing the revision. And so what you have, the green material is called first pass. So in eye tracking, they divide everything in saccades. So these are the little stops that your eyes make when they move. And so you have first pass, the green ones, and then you have the so-called second pass when you have to revise. And so by looking at where exactly people go back and how they revise, we can actually find a lot about the incremental processing. This is your famous visual world paradigm. So you have a boy, a train, a ball, a cake, and a car. Okay? And so what happens here is there are a couple of items which are target items, and they will depend on your lexical item. And then there are some items which are called distractors. So if you look at this picture and you hear the boy will eat, where are you going to look? Are you going to look at the train? No, you're going to look at the cake. Okay, so that means that eat primes us to look at the cake. And so what we see is, okay, we will find that people look at the cake much faster. The boy will move. What are you going to look at? That's a more challenging one. Either the car or the ball, right? How many people want to move the ball? Okay, so there, how many people would like to move the car? So here you have an ambiguity. With eat, it's clear he's going to look. You're going to look at the cake. With the move, you're going to look at either of them, and then you can add the third condition. The boy will draw. What are you going to look at? Pretty much anything, right? Because he can draw anything. Yes, please.
Gender plays a role here.
What?
Am I right? But gender
don't think in this one I think they controlled for gender, and they didn't find any difference. Oh, it depends very much on particular task. For example, in the recognition of pronouns versus he versus she, there is some gender preference, but it's not uniform. So there are some eye tracking studies for English where women pay more attention to she and men pay more attention to he, but it's not uniform. So I don't think we can say generally that gender plays a role. It depends a lot on what your lexical items are, what your design is. But you can certainly create some examples or some stimuli where gender which will be sensitive to gender. But so that's your classic example of the visual world paradigm. And my next one was ERP, but I have like 4 minutes left, so I'll stop here. If you guys have questions, I'll be happy to take them, and if not, we'll just start at this point tomorrow. Any questions?
Sorry, do you consider this that human beings don't use about learning and using language like economically and to be economic, and like we have the least effort principle. We like it to be simple and to make less effort. So human beings have processing issue. Okay, if it is long, then the processing is difficult for us. So when you use long sentences, the processing issue is a really important factor here. And when it gets longer, then the variation will be more. The ambiguity.
Right. Well, the ambiguity may not get greater. It depends on how you construct your stimuli. But certainly, if you have a sentence, the boy will eat the cake, as opposed to, I consider it believable that John thinks that the boy will eat the cake, you're increasing the complexity. And that's a very common problem in a lot of design. But for example, with ERPs, which we'll see tomorrow, you cannot use short sentences because the signal on the scalp is so weak that if you use small words and short sentences, you're not going to get any information. So there's always a trade-off. Remember how we said in the beginning that a lot depends on what you want to find out and what your measure is. And there are ways to trick your subjects. For example, in the RP labs, one of the things that we always have is Coca-Cola, because it has some caffeine, and people keep we don't give them coffee, but they can stay caffeinated, and we can keep their attention a little more. So again, if you look at the RPs, I'll show you some examples tomorrow. They're very artificial looking, and we did this Georgian experiment, which we normed with 1 million Georgians, and every time a new Georgian speaker looks at the examples, they say, "Oh, these are terrible. I will never say that." I was like, of course you won't, because will be reading them in the RP lab. So that's the trade-off there. With SAT, the speeded task, people use very simple sentences, and there the complaint is, oh, it's too simple. Yeah, so you have to be creative, you have to be clever, and you have to really find out what exactly it is that you want to know, because every method you're going to use will have some problems. So there's no perfect method, and these are all proxies. That's why I insisted on this word proxy.
But you think that generally it should be considered, yeah?
I'm sorry?
Generally it should be considered that processing issue.
Yeah.
As far as it's possible, we'll use the simple structures.
Well, it depends. I don't think there's a uniform answer. It depends on what you want to find out. Yeah, and then what do you want to control for? Like you asked about gender, we often control for handedness. When you do brain imaging, you always control for handedness. And in fact, there are some measures where you can see the handedness. Like I was born left-handed, and because of my age, I was reformed. So when I was little, I was told to use the right hand. And then I was a subject in a colleague's study, and he didn't ask me about handedness. And then when I got out of the scanner, he's like, why didn't you tell me you were left-handed? I wasted the scanner on you. So there was some measures which showed that I was wrong for his studies. So that's...
If you're going to run an experiment, there are a list of these factors to be considered.
If you want to run an experiment, first thing you do is you ask why. What is it that you want to find out? And the answer may be, you don't need to run an experiment. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But let's say the answer is yes, I need to run an experiment. Then you're asking, how sensitive is the measure? Like self-paced reading may not give you the right results, but you may start with that. Then you go to eye tracking, like he said. And only as a last resort do you run neural imaging, because that's very involved, it's very painful to do, it's complicated, and with fMRI it's very expensive. So that's like, if you're desperate, you do that, but typically for the types of questions we ask, we can actually do very well with behavioral measures. So like I said, there is some kind of an allure and glamour in doing neuroimaging, but you may find out less with that than you would find with a good behavioral experiment. So you need to sort of line up all the factors. Like what's the word order, what are the preferences in language, what's the frequency, and so on. So for each particular case, you sit down and write all your factors. And then you do the opposite of what theoretical people do, because theoretical people like all the factors considered. The experimental people are most successful when they throw out 90% of the factors and concentrate on like simple 2 by 2. So like when you run an experiment, say, so how many conditions? I go, oh, it's 2 by 2, good. If it's like 3 by 3 by 3, then you're in trouble. And again, we'll talk about that. So far I've been sort of giving you a very global view of things. On Wednesday, if I have time, I'll show you some experimental planning, and we may actually pick something. So if you have something in mind, let me know and we can discuss it in class. Because I don't know what you guys do, so it will be easier for me if I get some suggestions. All right?